On June 13th, 2026, a small patch of ground in Yellowstone National Park blew apart. Nobody was hurt. Nobody even saw it happen. USGS's Yellowstone Volcano Observatory found out through sensors. A spike in seismic activity, a burst of infrasound, and then, on a nearby live stream camera, a dark jet of water shooting out of the earth just after 5 in the morning. That part, on its own, wasn't the story. Yellowstone's Biscuit Basin has done this before, most recently in 2024. The story is what happened in the 2 days after. Not a slow settling, not a quiet return to normal. A hole in the ground turned into a boiling pool, and that pool started erupting on something close to a rhythm, regular enough that geologists studying it are calling the behavior a genuine first for a feature this young. And here's the part that actually matters for you. This isn't really a story about one hole in Wyoming. It's a story about how much of what's under Yellowstone is still, quite literally, invisible until it isn't. And that includes ground that tourists were standing on 2 days before it became a boiling pool. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what a hydrothermal explosion is and how it's different from a volcanic eruption, because those two get confused constantly, and they are not the same thing. You'll know the real numbers USGS has released about this new pool's size, temperature, and eruption pattern, and what those numbers mean in plain terms. You'll understand why scientists think this pool formed by collapse instead of explosion, and why that distinction matters for predicting what it does next. You'll see how this new pool fits into everything else Yellowstone's underground plumbing has been doing lately, from a famous acid geyser waking up after years of silence to the world's tallest active geyser a few hundred feet away. And you'll know exactly who is and isn't at risk from something like this, because the honest answer is more specific and less alarming for most people than you'd expect from a headline. If you've ever stood in one of Yellowstone's thermal basins on the boardwalks, smelling the sulfur, feeling the ground literally give off heat through your shoes, I want you to remember that feeling for the next few minutes, because it's about to make a lot more sense. And if this is new territory for you, stick around, because by the end, you'll understand this park's ground in a way most visitors never do. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking this pool as USGS publishes more data on it. This is very much still unfolding, not a closed case. So let's start with the basic mechanism, because you cannot understand what happened at Biscuit Basin without understanding what's actually underneath Yellowstone. Think of the ground under the park like a giant covered pot of water sitting on a stove that's always on low heat. That heat comes from magma, partly melted rock, sitting several miles down. It doesn't touch the water directly. Instead, it heats rock, and that rock heats groundwater trapped in cracks and pockets below the surface. Normally at sea level, water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. But underground, that water is under pressure. The weight of all the rock and water sitting on top of it, and pressure raises the boiling point the same way a pressure cooker keeps water from boiling even though it's much hotter than 212 degrees inside. So you end up with water that is well past its normal boiling point but hasn't actually turned to steam yet because it's being squeezed too hard by everything above it. Scientists studying this same basic process, even in miniature using small lab-built toy geysers to study the physics, have shown that this pressure and release cycle is the same fundamental engine behind every geyser on Earth, from a tabletop model to Old Faithful. A hydrothermal explosion happens when that pressure suddenly drops. Maybe a crack opens underground. Maybe something shifts and a plug of rock or mineral gives way, the kind of blockage that's been quietly building for months or years. The instant the pressure releases, that superheated water that's hotter than its normal boiling point but held liquid by pressure, flashes into steam almost instantly. Flashing means it doesn't boil gradually the way water does in a kettle. It converts nearly all at once, and steam takes up roughly almost 600 times more space than the liquid water it came from. That expansion is violent. It's the same basic physics as a soda can. Shake it, then pop the tab, and the sudden pressure drop turns dissolved gas into a rapid, forceful release. Except here, instead of foam spraying out of an 8-ounce can, you get rock, mud, and boiling water thrown into the air, sometimes for hundreds of feet, out of a system that's been pressurizing for years. This is different from a volcanic eruption, which involves actual magma reaching the surface. A hydrothermal explosion never touches magma directly. It's purely a water and steam event, powered by heat from magma below, but not magma itself. That's an important distinction, because it means a hydrothermal explosion at Yellowstone is not a sign that the park's volcano is waking up in the way people worry about when they hear the word supervolcano. It's Yellowstone's plumbing acting up, not Yellowstone's furnace. Geysers, hot springs, and hydrothermal explosions are all symptoms of the same shallow water system doing what it always does. It's the deep magma chamber underneath all of it that would actually need to move for a volcanic eruption to be on the table, and nothing about a plumbing event like this one involves that deeper system at all. Think about the difference in terms of depth and speed. A volcanic eruption draws on magma that can sit many miles beneath the surface, and building toward an actual eruption tends to involve changes scientists can track for months or years beforehand: swelling ground, migrating earthquake swarms, shifting gas emissions. A hydrothermal explosion, by contrast, is a shallow event, typically involving water and rock within the top few hundred feet of the surface, and it can go from stable to violent in seconds, with essentially no warning, because the trigger is a small mechanical failure, a blocked vent finally giving way, not a slow-building deep process. That's actually part of why hydrothermal explosions get so much attention, despite being the smaller of the two hazards. They're the one that can genuinely surprise you on a random Tuesday morning, while a true volcanic eruption is the kind of event scientists expect to see building for a long time first. It's also worth explaining why some ground is more prone to this than others, because why here and not somewhere else in the park is a fair question. Basins like Biscuit Basin and the nearby Norris Geyser Basin sit directly above particularly active, particularly shallow pockets of superheated groundwater, closer to the surface than in most of the rest of the park. Over time, minerals dissolved in that hot water, mostly silica, get deposited as the water cools near the surface, gradually cementing loose rock and gravel into a hard, sealed cap. That cap is what lets pressure build in the first place. Without it, steam would just leak out, gently instead of building toward a sudden release. But that same cap is also the weak point, because it's essentially a mineral crust holding back a pressurized system, and crusts like that can develop hidden voids and weaknesses underneath them for years before anyone on the surface notices anything different. Now here's where the June event gets genuinely unusual. When USGS geologists first checked the site after the June 13th explosion, they found something that told them exactly what kind of event this was. There was no debris field around the resulting hole. No scattered rock, no thrown mud in a wide radius, the kind of mess you'd expect from a violent blast. That absence of debris told them this specific feature likely formed by collapse, not explosion, meaning ground that had been weakened and hollowed out underground simply gave way and sank in rather than being blown upward and outward. Picture a sinkhole instead of a bomb crater. 2 days later, geologists went back to check on the site, and the ground they had walked across just 48 hours earlier had become an actively boiling pool. One member of the team described hearing distinct thumping sounds coming from inside the pool, caused by steam bubbles forming underwater and then collapsing, a sound like something breathing beneath the surface. That's not a metaphor for effect. It's a literal physical description of gas bubbles rising, hitting cooler water near the top, and imploding over and over. Let's walk through the actual numbers, because this is where the story stops being vague and starts being verifiable. USGS measured the largest vent feeding this new pool at about 61 feet long and up to 5 feet wide, roughly the length of a bowling lane, cut straight into the ground. The water pouring out of it into the nearby Firehole River was measured at around 194 degrees Fahrenheit. At Yellowstone's elevation, water boils at close to 200 degrees, not 212, because there's less air pressure pushing down on it up there. The same reason a pot of water boils faster on a mountain than at the beach. So, this water was sitting just a few degrees below its own boiling point, as close to boiling as liquid water gets without turning to steam, and hot enough to cause severe burns in seconds if anyone had touched it. When geologists returned 2 days after the explosion, they found the new pool itself measured about 21 by 17 feet, roughly the footprint of a one-car garage, filled with roiling, silty, near-boiling water, where there had been solid ground less than a week earlier. That's the part worth sitting, with a garage-sized pit of near-boiling water, appearing on ground where park staff had recently been standing, in under 2 days. Then came the eruptions. On June 18th, cameras captured the pool, sending intermittent jets of water 20 to 30 feet into the air, taller than a two-story house, in bursts rather than one continuous spray. In between those spouting episodes, USGS described the pool as roiling vigorously, meaning it never fully went quiet. It just alternated between violent boiling and violent spouting, like a kettle that never turns off, just changes how loud it's screaming. On June 23rd, 10 days after the original explosion, it erupted again, sending up a plume of steam and dirty water described as reaching tens of feet into the air. That's not one dramatic event followed by silence. That's a feature that keeps coming back, on a pattern regular enough that scientists are now treating it as worth long-term monitoring rather than a one-off. And this kind of behavior isn't unheard of in this exact basin. Earlier in 2026, less than 700 feet away, Yellowstone's Aquinas Geyser reawakened after nearly 6 years of silence, going from a single eruption in February to firing every 2 to 5 hours within days before falling quiet again weeks later. It's a reminder that this whole region of the park treats dormant as a temporary state, not a permanent one. Here's the detail that made geologists sit up, though. There's another well-known feature nearby called Black Diamond Pool, which has its own established pattern. Sharp temperature drops right after it erupts, like a bathtub draining fast and refilling with cooler water. When USGS reviewed sensor data near the new pool, they found only a small, gradual rise in heat, slowly settling back down to ambient air temperature. A completely different signature from Black Diamond's sudden crashes. That mismatch is actually what led investigators to the live stream footage in the first place, and to the 5:09 a.m., a dark water jet that confirmed a new, separate vent system was responsible. Not an extension of a feature they already understood. In other words, this pool isn't just new. It's behaving according to its own internal rules, ones scientists don't have a clean template for yet, in a basin where even the neighboring features don't behave the same way. It helps to compare this to the geyser most people already have a mental picture of Old Faithful. Old Faithful on June 13th, because its eruptions come on a fairly predictable interval, Yellowstone National Park, every 90 minutes. And it's been doing that reliably for well over a century of recorded observation. USGS's that predictability is actually rare among geysers sensors, not the norm. A spike in most of Yellowstone's roughly 10,000 hydrothermal features, and then on a nearby live stream geysers, a dark jet of water shooting out of the earth just after 5 don't run on anything close to a fixed clock. That part on its own some erupt for a few years. Yellowstone's Biscuit Basin has done this before, like the tallest active geyser on Earth, sitting a few hundred feet. The story is what happened in have gone as long as 8 years. Not a slow, without a single eruption, not a quiet firing again without warning. A hole in the ground. So when scientists say a brand new feature started erupting on something close, is already showing something close to a repeatable eruption. Geologists studying it, they're not describing a behavior, a genuine first. They're describing a feature skipping the decades-long part that actually figuring itself out phase. This isn't really a story about one hole in Wyoming goes through. It's a story about how much of what's under Yellowstone is still quite literally invisible until anywhere in the park's recorded history. And that includes also why the monitoring itself were standing on 2 days before it became a boiling pool. USGS's Yellowstone Volcano Observatory you'll know exactly what a hydrothermal camera pointed is and how it's different from a volcanic eruption. The agency maintains a permanent network of seismic sensors constantly, infrasound microphones that pick up low-frequency sound. You'll know the real numbers USGS has released about temperature loggers, live stream cameras across the park's most active basins. And what those numbers mean precisely because hydrothermal you'll understand why scientists think this pool formed by collapse that network instead of explosion. A park visitor with why that distinction matters for predicting what it does next. In the seismic see how this new pool fits into everything else. After the initial Yellowstone's underground plumbing, geologists didn't just observe from a distance. Acid geyser they physically returned to the site on foot within 48 hours. Tallest and then again days later, placing new temperature and seismic monitoring stations directly around the new pool. Because the every future eruption gets recorded with real data alarming for most instead of secondhand description. You'd expect from a headline. That's the difference between a geologic event you've ever stood in one of Yellowstone's thermal basins becomes usable science. Instruments in the ground running continuously, literally give off whether or not anyone happens to be watching. I want you to understand why any of this matters beyond one basin because it's about to make a lot more sense. Back at how this same if this is new territory for you, stick around. Very different by the end, you'll understand Yellowstone's hydrothermal explosions aren't rare in the park's geologic history. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking this pool like this USGS publishes more data on it. The park has seen larger ones too. Very much still unfolding. Mary Bay, on the edge of Yellowstone. So let's start with the basic mechanism because you cannot understand what happened at Biscuit Basin without understanding one that what's actually underneath Yellowstone. A mile and a half. Think of the ground thousands of years ago, like a giant covered pot of water. Same basic mechanism, stove that's always on water, suddenly losing pressure. That heat comes from magma. Can scale up dramatically under the right underground several miles down, turning a local. It doesn't touch the water that reshapes the landscape for millennia. It heats rock. And that rock heats groundwater trapped in cracks. A single event below, large enough to surface. A permanent mark on a lake. Normally at sea level, what happened water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. The opposite, but underground, smaller end water is under pressure. But it's the weight of the identical water sitting on top of it. With far less pressure raises the boiling point, the same way a pressure cooker recently keeps water from boiling, even though it's much hotter than the same basin, 12 degrees inside. So you end up with water that is well past its normal boiling point. It hasn't actually turned to steam yet. Closure has because it's stayed squeezed too hard by everything above it. Why the June scientists studying the same basic process was even in didn't put anyone in danger. There was simply no one standing to study the physics. And it's have shown remembering that Yellowstone's geysers have surprised the same fundamental engine behind every geyser on Earth. Steamboat Geyser, model, the tallest active geyser on Earth. A hydrothermal explosion in the same general area that pressure has gone as long as 8 years. Maybe a crack opens underground before firing again with no real warning. And a plug of rock part of why scientists are cautious the kind of blockage a clean, predictable pattern for anything this young. The instant the pressure releases, Geyser's history shows the same lesson from a different angle. Water that's hotter than its normal boiling point but held liquid by pressure grew more intense into steam almost less predictable through the flashing means it doesn't boil gradually the way water does in a kettle. It converts nearly all at once. Brief, scattered active takes up roughly almost 600 times more that space. Yellowstone's features don't just switch on and stay on. Expansion is violent. They evolve. It's the same basic physics as a soda can. Nobody fully predicts and pop the tab. and the sudden pressure drop turns dissolved gas
those
into a
closures
rapid,
matter.
forceful release.
Let's talk honestly about
Except here,
who actually
instead
faces
of
risk from
foam
something like
spraying
this.
out of an 8-ounce
Because it's a
can,
much smaller
you
group
get
than the
rock,
phrase
mud,
Yellowstone
boiling
explosion
water thrown
makes it
into the
sound.
air.
Sometimes
Park
for
visitors on the
hundreds of
marquee,
feet,
boardwalks,
out of a system that's been pressurizing for
the
years.
group park managers
This is
worry
different
about
from
most,
volcanic
which is
eruption,
exactly
which
why
involves
areas
actual
with
magma
history
reaching
of
the surface.
hydrothermal activity.
A hydrothermal
The
explosion
Biscuit
never
Basin
touches
since
magma directly.
2024.
It's purely a
Closed
water
off
and
after
steam
incidents
event,
like this
powered
one,
by heat,
sometimes
from
for
magma
years
below,
at a
but not
time rather
magma
than
itself.
days.
That's
That's
an
an
important
important
distinction
distinction
people have been
because it means a
seriously hurt at
hydrothermal explosion
Yellowstone's
at
other thermal
Yellowstone is not a
features
sign
in
that
past decades by
the
stepping
park's
off
volcano
marked
is
paths,
waking up,
which is a
and the
large
way
part of
people
why
worry
the
about
park
when they
treats
hear
these
the word
closures as
supervolcano
non-negotiable, rather than a
It's
formality.
Yellowstone's plumbing,
Park
park
staff
staff,
and
not
researchers
Yellowstone's
who work
furnace.
directly in geysers,
These basins,
hot springs, and
placing
hydrothermal
monitoring
explosions,
equipment, or taking
are all
measurements,
symptoms of the
carry a
same
different,
shallow
more
water
direct
system
kind of
doing what it
exposure.
always does. And they're the ones
It's
who
the
train
deep magma
specifically
chamber
for
underneath
reading all of
ground
it that
water
would actually
conditions.
need to move for a
Before
volcanic
stepping into an
eruption
area,
to be on the
watching
table
for discoloration.
Nothing about a
Steam
plumbing event
patterns
like
and
this
recent
one
ground
involves
disturbances
that
warning.
deeper system at all.
Signs,
Think
often
about
working
the
in pairs,
difference in
specifically,
terms of
so
depth
someone can
and
call
speed.
for help if the ground
A
gives
volcanic
way
eruption
beneath a
draws
colleague.
on magma that can sit
Off-trail
many
hikers
miles
who
beneath
wander
the
away
surface,
from marked paths
and building
anywhere
toward
in
Yellowstone's
Yellowstone's
thermal
tends
zones
to involve
are
honestly
honestly
the
the highest
highest
can
risk
track
group
for
of all,
months or years
because the
beforehand.
boardwalks exist
Swelling
precisely
ground,
over ground,
migrating
earthquake
earthquake
storms,
storms,
and
reject
reject gas emissions.
and the ground just a
A
few feet
hydrothermal
off
explosion,
them may not have
by
been tested
contrast,
at all. It's a shallow
the
event,
same typically
involving
involving
water
water
and
and
rock
rock
that
within the
created
top
this new
few hundred
pool
feet
on
of the
empty
surface.
ground, and it can go from
Exactly what
stable
makes
to
wandering
violent
off
in
trail.
seconds. With
In any
essentially
thermal
no warning,
basin,
because the
genuinely
trigger is
dangerous,
a
not just
small
against the
mechanical
rules.
failure,
And
a
nearby
block event
ecosystems
finally giving way,
the fish,
not
and
a slow
invertebrates
building
in the
deep
Firehole
process,
River,
which is now
that's
receiving
actually
a
part
steady
of why
flow of
hydrothermal
near boiling
explosions
water from this
get
new
so
vent
much
system,
attention,
despite
being
being
a
a real,
smaller,
smaller, dramatic
two
hazards.
pressure from sudden
They're the
shifts in
one that
water
can
temperature
genuinely
and chemistry
surprise you on a
that's
random
worth watching
Tuesday
as this
morning,
continues.
while a true
Since
volcanic
river
eruption
ecosystems
is the
downstream
kind
of
of
thermal
event
basins
scientists expect to
are
see
generally
building
adapted to some
for a long
input
time
first,
but not
It's
necessarily
also
to
worth
a brand new
explaining why some
concentrated
ground is
source
more
appearing
prone to this than
overnight.
others,
It's
because
also worth
why here and not somewhere else in the park
being
is a fair
specific
question.
about who this story is
Basins
genuinely
like Biscuit
not
Basin
a threat to,
and the nearby Norris
because
Geyser
disaster
Basin
content has a
sit
habit
directly
of making
above
everyone feel at
particularly
risk when the
active,
honest picture
particularly
is much
shallow
narrower.
pockets of superheated
If you live
groundwater,
anywhere outside the
closer to
immediate
the surface
footprint
than
than
most of the rest of
thermal
the park,
basins,
over
which
time,
is a tiny fraction
minerals
of the park's
dissolve in
total
that
area.
hot water, mostly
The
silica,
hydrothermal
gets
explosion
deposited
like
as
this
the
one
water
has
cools near the
essentially
surface,
no way of
gradually
reaching
cementing
you.
loose rock and
It doesn't
gravel
produce
into a
ash
hard,
clouds, lava
sealed
flows,
cap.
or regional
That cap
evacuations
is what
the
lets
way
pressure build in the
natural
first
volcanic
place.
eruption
Without
would.
it, steam
It's
would
a
just leak
localized
out
ground level
gently
event
instead of
measured
building
in
toward
tens
a
of
sudden
feet,
release,
not miles.
But that same cap
People
is also
who
a
need to
weak
think
point,
about
because
this
it's essentially a
practically are the
mineral
ones
crust
planning to
holding back
physically walk
pressurized
through
systems.
Yellowstone's
Crusts
active
like
geyser
that
basins.
can develop hidden
Everyone
voids
else
and
can treat
weaknesses
this
underneath
as
them
what it
for
actually
years
is
before anyone on
a
the surface
genuinely interesting
notices anything
geological
different
event.
happening.
Now
In a
here's
very
where the
specific,
June event gets
very well
genuinely
monitored place.
unusual. One that
When
says more
USGS
about how young
geologists
and
first
active
checked
this
the
basin
site
still
after the
is
June
than about
13th
any wider
explosion,
threat to anyone
they
reading
found
a
something
headline
that
from
told them
1,000
exactly
miles
what kind
away.
of event this was.
There's one
There was
more
no
group
debris
worth
field,
mentioning because
around the
it's
resulting
easy to
hole,
overlook
no scattered rock,
the millions
no
of people
thrown
who
mud
visit
in a wide
Yellowstone
radius,
every year
the
without
kind of
ever
mess you'd
setting
expect
foot
from
in
a
an
violent
active
blast.
thermal basin at
That
all.
absence of debris
If
told
your
them
trip
this
is
specific
centered on
feature
wildlife
likely
watching,
formed by collapse,
canyon
not
overlooks,
explosion
or the lake,
meaning ground.
the story doesn't
that had been
change your
weakened and
plans
hollowed
at
out
any
underground
meaningful way.
simply gave way
It's a
and
reminder
sank
to
in
respect
rather than
posted
being
closures
blown
if your
upward and
route
outward
happens to pass near
Picture a
Biscuit Basin
sinkhole
instead
of
of
a
a
bomb
reason to
crater.
reconsider the visit itself.
2 days later,
Context like
geologists
that
went back
matters,
to check on the
because
site.
the goal
The
of a
ground
video
they
like
had walked
this is
across
to leave you better informed.
just 48
not
hours
more.
earlier had
Anxious
become an
about a
actively
park that,
boiling pool.
for the overwhelming
One
majority
member of the
its
team
visitors,
described hearing
remains
distinct
exactly as
thumping
safe as
sounds
it's
coming
always
from
been.
inside the pool.
Now, caused
The
by
honest
steam bubbles
complication,
forming underwater,
because a
and then
responsible
collapsing,
video about this doesn't
sound
pretend
like
to know
something
more
breathing
than the
beneath the
scientists
surface.
studying it do.
That's not a metaphor for
USGS
effect.
has been direct
It's a
that
literal
they
physical
don't yet know
description
how
of
long
gas
this bubbles
bubbles
eruption
rising,
pattern will
hitting
continue,
cooler water
whether
near
it
the
will
top
settle
and
into something more
imploding over
predictable,
and over.
fade out
That's
entirely the way many hydrothermal
because
features
this
eventually
is where
do.
the story
Shift
stops
into a
being
different
vague and
kind of
starts being
behavior
verifiable.
altogether.
Common
USGS
misconception,
measured
the largest
what
event
is
feeding
here,
this new pool
increased
about
hydrothermal
61 feet
or
long
geyser
and up
activity
to
at
5 feet
Yellowstone is
wide,
not
roughly the length of a bowling lane,
a sign of an
approaching
approaching
volcanic
volcanic
eruption.
eruption.
The water pouring out of it into the nearby Firehole River was measured at around 194 degrees
USGS
Fahrenheit.
itself has publicly
At
described
Yellowstone's
this kind of
elevation,
shift with
water
the plain
boils at
phrase
close to
that's
200
Yellowstone
degrees,
being Yellowstone.
not 212.
A reminder
Because
that
there's
parts
less
shallow
shallow
water
water
pushing
pushing
down
down
on
on
it
it
up
up
there.
there.
Far more
The same
often
reason a
and
pot
far
of
less
water boils
ominously
faster
than
on a
people
mountain than at the
assume
beach.
when a headline
So,
uses the
this
word
water was
eruption.
sitting just a few degrees
What makes
below
this
its own
particular
boiling
pool
point.
worth tracking
Isn't
isn't
close
danger.
to boiling
It's the
as
fact
liquid
that
water
scientists
gets without
don't
turning
have
to
a clean
steam
precedent for a
and hot
feature
enough to cause
this
severe
young settling
burns
in
into a
seconds
regular
if
eruption
anyone
pattern
touched
this
it.
fast.
When
When
geologists
geologists
returned
returned
2
2
days
days
after
after
the
the
explosion,
explosion,
that turns
they
into
found a new
genuinely
pool
new
itself
science over the
measured
next
about
few months.
21 by 17
As more
feet.
eruption cycles get
roughly
recorded
the
and
footprint of
compared
a
against
one-car
each other,
garage, filled with
there's
roiling,
a second layer of
silty,
uncertainty
near boiling
worth
water,
naming honestly too,
where there had been
which is
solid
that
ground less
regular
than a week
doesn't
earlier.
necessarily mean
That's the part worth
understood.
sitting.
With
Even Old Faithful,
a garage
with over a century of observation
near boiling
behind
water
it, still isn't
appearing
appearing
on
on
ground
ground
where
where
park
park
staff
its intervals
recently
between
been
eruptions
standing
has
in under
drifted
2
over
days.
decades
and
Then came
geologists
the
still debate
eruptions.
exactly how much of that drift
On June
comes from
18th,
underground plumbing
cameras
changes
captured the
versus
pool
other
sending
factors.
intermittent jets of
So
water
even if
20
this new
to
pool
30
keeps
feet
up a
into the air,
consistent-looking rhythm
taller
for
than a
weeks or
two-story
small
house,
months, that
and
alone will
bursts
tell scientists
rather
why
than
it's
one
doing that.
continuous spray.
Only that it is.
In between those
Figuring
spouting
out why,
episodes,
USGS
specific
described
underground
the pool
plumbing
as
shape
boiling
produces
vigorously,
a pattern this
meaning
clean
it
never
never
fully
early
went
in a
quiet.
feature's life, just
Is
alternated
a separate,
between violent
harder
boiling
question,
and violent
and
spouting.
it's the one the
Like a
new
kettle
monitoring
that never
stations around the pool
turns off,
are really
just changes
there
how
to help
loud it's
answer.
screaming.
It's also
On
possible,
June 23rd,
worth saying
10
plainly,
days after the
that
original
pattern
explosion,
could break down
it
entirely
erupted
with
again,
no warning.
sending up
The
the
plume
same
was
weight of
steered
steam
with
and
no
dirty
warning,
water
because
described
a
as
system
reaching
this young
tens of
and this
feet
newly
into the air.
exposed hasn't had time to
That's
settle
not
into
one
anything
dramatic event
permanent.
followed by silence.
That's a feature that keeps
Another
coming back.
honest gap
on a
that we
pattern
can
regular
currently
enough
say
that
with
scientists
confidence
are now
how this
treating
new
it
pool
as
connects
worth long-term
underground
monitoring
to the rest
rather
of
than a
Biscuit
one-off.
Basin's plumbing.
And this kind of
Black
behavior
Diamond Pool
isn't unheard of in this
2024
exact basin.
explosion site nearby.
Earlier in 2026,
Mismatched
less
temperature
than
signatures
700
between
feet
this
away,
pool and Black Diamond
Yellowstone's
suggest
Geyser
they're on
reawakened
separate
after
systems,
nearly
but
6 years of
separate
silence.
underground doesn't
Going from a
necessarily
single
mean
eruption
permanently
in February
unconnected.
to firing
And
every
basins
2
like
to
this
5
one are
hours
known for
within
shifting,
days,
which vents
before
are
active
falling
over
quiet
time as
again
mineral
weeks
deposits
later.
block some pathways.
It's a reminder
and open
that
others.
this whole region
That
of the
means
park
this story
treats
isn't just
dormant
unresolved
as
in
a
the sense
temporary
of
state.
we'll know more
Not a
later.
permanent one.
It's unresolved in the more
Here's the
fundamental
detail
sense
that made geologists
the underlying
sit up,
plumbing
though.
map itself is still
There's
being
another
drawn.
well-known feature
So
nearby
what can you
called
actually
Black
do with
Diamond
this
Pool,
beyond
which
finding
has
it
its
interesting?
own established pattern.
If you're planning a Yellowstone
Sharp
trip,
temperature drops
check the
right
National,
after it erupts.
Park
like
Service's
a
current alerts
bathtub
for Biscuit
drained
Basin
fast
and
and
any other
refilling
thermal
with
areas
cooler
before
water.
you go. Since
USGS
USGS
reviewed
reviewed
sensor
sensor
data
data
near
near
the
the
new
new
pool,
pool, they found only a
what's
small
closed today
gradual
may
rise in
not be
heat,
what's closed by the
slowly
time you
settling
arrive.
back down to ambient
If you're
air
already the
temperature.
kind of person who hikes in
Completely
thermal
different
basins,
signature from Black
stay on the
Diamond
marked
sudden
boardwalks
crashes.
every time, without exception.
That mismatch is
even
actually
in
what
areas
led
that look
investigators to
solid
the
under
live stream
foot.
footage in the
The
first
ground's
place,
history
and to
matters
the 5
more than how it
a.m.
looks on a
dark
given
water
day.
jet,
And
the
the
crust
crust
knew
knew
a
a
certain
person's
weight
weight
last
last
month
responsible.
isn't
Not
guaranteed
an
to hold
extension of
this
the
month.
feature they already
And
understood.
if you want to actually
In other
follow
words,
real
this
science,
pool
instead of
isn't just
secondhand
new.
headlines,
It's behaving according to its own
USGS's
internal rules.
Yellowstone Volcano
One's
Observatory
scientists don't have a
publishes
clean
its
template
monitoring
for you.
updates
The
directly
basin
and
where
for free.
even the neighboring features
And reading
don't behave
those
the
is
same
a
way.
far more reliable
It
way
helps
to
compare
understand
this
what's
to the
happening
Geyser
under the
most
park
people already
than any